And we're going to skip item 16 until after 2 o'clock. Matthew has an engagement going on, so we'll jump to item 17. Sequoia.
Sure, thank you. Thanks, Vice Chair Alvarado. Commissioners, tab 17 is an informal presentation focused on statewide community listening sessions from Jeannie Ward-Waller, Deputy Director for Planning and Modal Programs at Caltrans. Jeannie will provide updates on the scope, schedule, and format of upcoming statewide community listening sessions that we are partnering on with Caltrans and the California State Transportation Agency. With that, I will turn it over to Jeannie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sequoia, and good afternoon, commissioners. Hope everyone had a good lunch. I'm excited to join you for this item. Go ahead and jump to the next slide. This community statewide listening sessions is a really exciting effort. It's been a little bit long in coming, but we're really excited to be kicking it off in partnership with CTC and CalSTA. As Sequoia said, we've been working really closely with staffs from both agencies, and we now have a consultant on board, ICF Consulting, which took some time, but we're thrilled to have some resources to put into this effort. At a high level, this will be 6 sessions conducted virtually in early 2022. I'll share on an upcoming slide kind of where the focus areas will be, but we are looking at focusing on some specific neighborhoods that have been really impacted historically by transportation and are still burdened and underserved with respect to transportation. We will be doing outreach to those communities in close partnership with community-based organizations, and we will be actually contracting directly with community-based organizations in those locations to support the sessions and help us do outreach. This is a really important aspect of the work, making sure we're working with trusted leaders in the communities to help us identify community members to participate and to do that outreach. So we have had quite a bit of discussion about how to do this in a thoughtful and meaningful way. We do intend at this point to invite community members directly to participate and to limit the participation so that we can make sure to create time and intentional space in these sessions to really hear directly from community members, hear about their personal experience and their needs and the history of these communities. So we've had quite a bit of discussion about what makes sense in terms of how to do that and the size of the sessions and how to make it manageable. We also intend for this just to be a starting point. So I want to say that right up front, this contract, this initial effort will be 6 sessions, but we will continue to do these sorts of listening sessions in the future. We've already talked about engaging some of our research resources in doing that. So again, this is just a jumping off point. This will not be, the only effort like this that we undertake between our 3 agencies. So go ahead and jump to the next slide. The purpose of these sessions, as I've already said, is really to listen to the communities. So we want to create space to hear personal testimony from individuals in communities that have been impacted by the transportation system. We know and we have acknowledged in all of our agencies' equity statements that transportation has had a big impact on communities. It's divided, it's displaced communities. And so we really need to hear and understand and grapple with that history. In addition, this is an opportunity for all of our agencies to foster improved relationships and trust in those communities. And that really does start by coming with an open heart and listening and hearing the personal experience and also the needs, including current challenges and opportunities in these communities. And then it's really important that we document what we hear, that we validate and verify that with the people that we've heard from, make sure that we're capturing the input that they've given us accurately, and producing a report. So that is one of the key outputs from this effort, is that we want to make sure we capture and we actually reflect back what we've heard from these sessions. Next slide, please. This slide is showing kind of where we are in terms of developing these sessions and where we're headed. The next several months is where a lot of the organizing work, engaging in those partnerships with community-based organizations, figuring out the logistics, and also doing training for our own agency staff and officials that will be participating in the session. We want to make sure, again, we're all coming with the right tone, coming into the room ready to listen. So we want to be really thoughtful about setting up that environment. The sessions themselves will be conducted in early in the new year. So we're aiming for January and February timeframe for those 6 sessions. And then the months following that will be kind of the wrap-up work to write the report and document what we've heard. Next slide, please. This slide shows the potential focus areas that we've identified. This is draft, but we've been very thoughtful about trying to identify communities where we want to focus. We're engaged in a lot of other efforts, including a research contract that's currently going on to look at the history of several communities around this state and understand, the impacts of transportation. We're also we've applied for a federal grant from the RAISE program to look at reconnecting communities in several key locations. And so we tried to not duplicate those efforts in terms of where we're focusing, but fill some gaps in other parts of the state where we know that there are significant needs and we really need to hear and understand and again, build trust with communities. So on the left side of this slide are the communities that we've currently identified to focus on with these 6 sessions. And then on the right side are some of the populations, groups, demographics that we really want to focus our outreach on bringing in from these communities. These are the groups we know are particularly marginalized with respect to transportation. And we want to make sure we're hearing from a really diverse group of individuals in each session. Last slide, please, or I think I have 2 more, but 1 more with content on it. Thank you. So this slide is just showing our draft format for each of the sessions. We will be facilitating between the consultants and our own staff in the Caltrans Office of Race and Equity. We'll be helping to actually facilitate the sessions. We intend to have officials, representatives from all 3 agencies, Caltrans, CTC, and CalSTA, in the sessions, although we don't want to overwhelm the participants by having too many state officials in each session. So we're going to make an effort to strike a balance in terms of the number of state officials versus community member participants in each session. Of course, we're still in pandemic time, so we'll be doing these sessions virtually. And we intend to record the sessions so that others who are not sitting in the session directly can still benefit and hear what we hear. And then each session will roughly follow this format. At least this is our draft format at this point. These agendas may evolve a little bit, but we're thinking approximately a 2.5-hour agenda with a lot of time carved out to, as I said, really intentionally listen and hear from the participants directly. So with that, I think my last slide just has our contact information for myself and our key staff in the Caltrans Office of Race and Equity that are leading this work. And I will stop there and open up to questions. Thank you.
Okay, Commissioner Falcon had a question.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Thanks for the presentation, Jeannie. I was at the Equity Advisory working group on this item and made comments already, but I don't know if it was an oversight, but I do recall that as part of the communities of focus that San Diego's Portside communities was included, and just wanted to know if That was just, it was a modification of that list.
We did modify the list. Thank you for asking about that, Commissioner Falcone. So the portside communities in San Diego are also identified for our federal RAISE grant, which is focused on reconnecting communities. That's one of the communities we've really, we'd like to focus on. And that grant is setting up a program where, we want to directly engage with communities that have been divided by freeways and develop community-centered solutions to reconnecting those communities. So in going back and looking and trying to create a geographic balance around the state in terms of the communities we're focusing on, we decided that since we'll be focusing there with our RAISE grant, that we would select a different community for this effort, for this listening session effort. And we also heard from the commission as we've been refining the list that we should really focus on an Inland Empire community. And so there have been some changes to the list since we shared it with you last.
Okay, absolutely, and I appreciate that. And we definitely need to have a robust swath of communities throughout the state. One other I just want to mention, and I don't know if it's another community just at least on the radar, is this community of San Ysidro, which has been since the I-5 was built and really divided that community on the border, and has been disproportionately impacted by the traffic and the queuing up, and it's one of the busiest borders in the world, so you can imagine how that's impacted the community there. So just wanted to put that on the radar screen. Thank you, Jeannie.
Thank you, Commissioner. And I just want to offer that in our first call out to our Caltrans districts and trying to decide which communities to prioritize for our RAISE grant, the districts actually offered up 70 communities. So I'm sure we all have a good sense that this is an issue all over the state, and we really have to start somewhere. This is our list at this point. We're very much open to refining it, so we will go back and take another look at San Ysidro. Thank you.
Commissioner Liu?
Thank you, Vice Chair. Jean, just wanted to thank you for the work that you put in and the work of all those involved in this. I know that our staff has been working on this and that CalSTA staff are working on it. This is an important milestone. I think we should take a second to stop and realize that getting to the listening session stage is an important one in this process of trying to achieve transportation equity. And I just want to thank you for the work you're putting in and let you know I'm here to help if you need me for anything.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Liu.
Any other questions from the commission? Jeannie, and I think Commissioner Falcone brought up a good point because, all three of the ports in the state, the biggest issue we have is those multimodal yards and the truck traffic going in and out of there. So historically, there's probably been a lot of impact transportation-wise on the community. So because I noticed you had Richmond on there, but are we going to reach out to Long Beach, LA, Oakland as well? Is it like you did with San Diego?
We're trying to strike a balance. We do have Wilmington, which is in the Los Angeles port area. So there are so many communities that we've really tried to kind of strike a balance of the types of transportation impacts that we see. But we'll take another look. We really appreciate the commissioners offering communities that you want us to specifically take a look at. So we'll go back and discuss that with the staff.
Yeah, this is going to be, I don't know how you're going to manage it, to tell you the truth. I mean, I wish you the best of luck. I mean, I know that you guys are working hard and there's no way that you're not going to succeed, but this is quite a project that you've taken on. Douglas, do we have any comments from the public?
This is Joe Tavoloni. Can I speak?
Oh, sure.
I just, driving in, heard that the president was on television this morning, and you all probably know about it. But what he is saying is that in order to, and I may be clear off base on this, but he said that he was going to have deliveries 24 hours a day, 24/7, and in order to get goods on the shelves, and that is supposedly supposed to start soon or right away. So they guess they're going to be delivering around the clock. That's my understanding.
Very good.
And maybe this doesn't even pertain to what you all are talking about, because I just got on. Sorry
Okay.
for that.
That's okay.
Okay, thank you.
Douglas, back to the public.
Vice Chair Alvarado, I do not see any public comment at this time. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jeannie. And like I said, I wish you guys the best of luck with this thing.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Appreciate it.
You have literally taken on the elephant in the room. Okay, then we'll move on to item 18. Sequoia.
Thank you, Vice Chair Alvarado. Commissioners, tab 18 is an informational presentation focused on lessons learned from agency leaders who have established equity advisory committees. Veronica Eady, Senior Deputy Executive Director, Officer of Policy and Equity at the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, provides leadership for the district on environmental justice matters and community engagement, diversity, equity, and inclusion program and policy work. Ms. Eady will share her experiences and best practices in setting up community advisory committees focused on equity, environmental justice, and related elements. With that, I will turn it over to Ms. Eady. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Great. Can everybody hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, super. Thank you for having me. I am Veronica Eady from the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. Commissioner Alvarado, thank you for wearing a giant shirt today. Put me in a good mood. I only have a few slides here, and hopefully this will be a stepping off point for a robust discussion. Next slide, please. So, as a local government agency, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District is subject to the Brown Act. And so we have a number of advisory bodies that are governed by the Brown Act. First of all, the Scientific Advisory Council is a statutory body, and as set out in statute, it is subject to the Brown Act. I'll get into a minute why that is important. We're right now in the process of establishing our first Community Advisory Council, and this Community Advisory Council, or CAC, will advise us on issues of environmental justice and equity and all of the work that we do at the Air District. So we're really excited about it. We're closing in on the part of the process where the board actually gets to empanel the group. We do have a little bit of experience with a community sort of advisory body that's subject to the Brown Act through our AB 617 program. And so AB 617, I won't get into the nuts and bolts of it, but it is a program that is governed by the Air Resources Board as well as the air districts that have these communities that are overburdened by air pollution. So in the Bay Area, we have West Oakland and we have Richmond San Pablo. West Oakland, the steering committee, which is a multi-stakeholder steering committee, opted not to, the community in West Oakland, the community group that we're working with, West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project, opted not to have a Brown Act committee. Richmond San Pablo is a different case. And so Richmond San Pablo, we brought together an informal group of volunteers from the community who wanted to help us recruit for and put together the guiding principles for the community steering committee in Richmond San Pablo. Because of the level of trust that we have in Richmond San Pablo as opposed to West Oakland, the advisory group that we put together, the community design team that designed the steering committee process, they really wanted to have a Brown Act body. They wanted to keep the Air District accountable. They wanted the utmost transparency, and so they asked for a Brown Act committee. So we do have a Brown Act committee in Richmond, San Pablo, and we're working on that for the broader Community Advisory Council. Some of the things that we've run into is that to be a Brown Act committee, the committee has to be appointed by our board. So kind of an analog to Bagley-Keene. What that means in practice is that we had a model already with our Scientific Advisory Council of how we appoint. That means that the board can adopt whatever procedure that they want. So with the Scientific Advisory Council, the board's administrative committee actually did interviews with all of the candidates. It became a little bit unwieldy both with Richmond San Pablo as well as with the Community Advisory Council that we're in the process of appointing. We had a solicitation process, but with the Community Advisory Council, we actually had almost 150 applicants. So it really complicated how we wanted to go through the process of screening applicants, setting up interviews. It's quite a complicated process. It's working really well in Richmond, San Pablo, I'll say. We went through this complicated process. The board had a 3-hour meeting just to consider those applicants. But I will say that as that steering committee is functioning, it's actually going quite well. It required additional staffing for us. We're still grappling what that means, but it means that, you know, we have a clerk who runs the meeting. It means that all of our agendas need to be posted in advance. It means that, you know, we can't have a quorum for, you know, smaller meetings or subcommittees that we might want to put together for the Richmond San Pablo process. So there was a lot in it that creates, frankly, a staffing burden on us, but this is what the community wanted, and so we're following through with it. I did put on this slide the AB 617 consultation group. This is a group that was put together by the Air Resources Board. I was actually at the Air Resources Board when this multi-stakeholder group was put together, and if I recall correctly, it was not a body that was appointed by the board, but the legal staff at CARB felt strongly about observing the boundaries of Bagley-Keene, just to be clear that and not run afoul of any of the requirements of Bagley-Keene. So that's always an option. And with respect to AB 617, there are certainly steering committees in other parts of the state that do not have board appointed committees, but have decided that they want to comply with Bagley-Keene anyway, just to ensure the accountability and the transparency. Next slide, please. So I talked a little bit about the process with a Brown Act committee. We have laid out here for you now what those steps were. So we did a public solicitation. We actually relied on community members, board members to publicize the solicitation process. So for example, we had our board members who are on boards of supervisors or city councils or who are otherwise elected officials to really take the lead in getting the solicitation out to their constituents. I'll use the example of the Community Advisory Council in particular. So the board put together what they wanted the Community Advisory Council to look like. So the Air District represents the 9 Bay Area counties, and the staff, taking direction from the board, went through a process of calculating how many people did we want to have on the Community Advisory Council, how many members from each county. We decided to go with, or the board directed us to go with a process that weighted by population. So for example, the Community Advisory Council will have 15 members altogether. 4 of those members will be from Alameda County. 4 of them will be from Contra Costa County. For smaller counties like San Francisco, there's only 1 member. And for communities or counties that don't have as many disadvantaged communities under Cal EnviroScreen, like Napa County, Sonoma County, Marin County, we decided to have 2 at-large members who come from those 3 counties. We had ongoing advice from the board throughout the process where the staff was coming up with, or doing the hard work of figuring out what the constituency of the Community Advisory Council would look like. Of the 150 applications that we got, the staff put together a small panel of community members who had not applied for the CAC and sister agency staff like the Air Resources Board. I'm trying to remember, we had another sister agency who provided staffing to go through those 150 applications, score them, screen them, score them, and recommend people who would be interviewed. So of those 150, we're interviewing about 30 people. Interviewing 30 people, as you can imagine, is quite an investment, and we really did want to have board members doing those interviews. And the board wanted board members to be doing those interviews. We got creative, and in fact, we're in the middle of our interviewing process right now. We found a program, and I'm sure there are plenty of them out there, where the applicants could record their responses to 2 questions that the board members came up with. Broad questions like, why do you want to be on this Community Advisory Council? What are the areas where the board and the agency could do better in terms of environmental justice and equity? Broad questions like that. So right now, we have those 30 people going through that process. The interviews themselves are recorded. They are 10 minutes long. And then we have a small panel of board members and a community person who will view those 30 10-minute interviews and develop a slate. They'll come to our board. We actually have a board equity, community equity, health and justice committee. And that committee will go through the information that they get from the interviews and come up with a slate. That slate will go to the full board for approval. This is more or less the same process that we went through with the Richmond San Pablo Steering Committee. We didn't have the 10-minute interviews. They actually had Zoom interviews with the candidates, but we found this to be a little bit more streamlined and efficient. We are concerned about, technical difficulties that some of the applicants might have. So we do, as they're recording their interviews, do have a staff person and a human resources person on tap to make sure that everything goes smoothly. Next slide, please. So there are a few other considerations that we're dealing with right now. Here we are in 2021, and I would say that the best practice right now in 2021 is to offer stipends. So for our steering committees, and I should say that AB 617 sort of pushed us into the stipend land. That was where the community members first asked for to be compensated. And there were a couple of community steering committees under AB 617 that were already doing stipends, and so we followed their lead. One of them was in Imperial, where a community group was partnered with the Air District in Imperial, and they were getting stipends. CARB decided that since Imperial had and West Oakland as well had started this best practice, that they would require this throughout the state. When CARB decided that we were going to offer it throughout the state, then we started paying stipends for many of our formal and informal advisory bodies. We're pulling together a stipend policy because the level of work and homework that goes into these advisory bodies differ based on how frequently they meet, what's the format. So, you know, we do have the community advisory committee that we're putting together, and our executive officer, Jack Broadbent, felt like this Community Advisory Council is going to be the highest level of all of the advisory bodies that we have. Originally, we were planning to pay $100 per meeting, which was kind of the gold standard that CARB was using with their Environmental Justice Advisory Committee. But as we were pulling our committee together, CARB actually increased from $100 per meeting to $500 per meeting for their Environmental Justice Advisory Council. So for us, for our Community Advisory Council, we will be paying $500 per meeting, but that's sort of the top, where that body is a Brown Act body. It's advising the board directly, advising staff, and we really felt like it warranted that $500. We have other committees that are less formal, where we are giving $100 per meeting. I should say that one of our partner agencies, the Bay Conservation Development Commission, they put together an environmental justice group of advisors, and for their body, they're paying $6,000 per person per year. So in our stipend policy, which is in the works right now, staff is going through and collecting information, like the information from CARB, the information from BCDC, looking at things like, well, what is a living wage in that region? And that's the type of reasoning that went into BCDC's decision to give $6,000 per year. Some of our less informal focus groups and community design teams and groups like that, sometimes we will give them a gift card of $200 if they're, or $100 if they're advising us on one thing and only meeting one time, or we have some sort of a focus group. So when we do have our stipend policy ready, we'd be happy to share that. Right now it's in draft, and we're doing a lot more research in pulling it together. Setting expectations. In our case, we do, for example, with our steering committees, we do partnership agreements, which lay out the broad guidelines for engaging with community members. Our community steering committees do have charters that lay out governance and things of that sort. One thing to mention, though, is that with our steering committee in Richmond, San Pablo, the Brown Act committee, we are still dealing with things like, how do you fill seats when people withdraw for whatever reason? Those things could be laid out in the charter, but since this is our first time out of the gate, some of this feels like we're making it up as it goes along. So we actually have 4 vacancies on our Richmond San Pablo steering committee, which that steering committee is, the board told us that they wanted to have 31 members. So we're down by 4 right now, and we're going through conversations with our board and a process with our board for coming up with a stable of people that the board approves, that staff and the steering committee together can just pull from that list of people to fill vacancies. Partnership and power sharing. We're running into this at the Air District. I've seen it happen at CARB as well with their Environmental Justice Advisory Committee. on how do we function together. At CARB with their EJAC, they actually, in the process that they did a few years ago, they did have joint meetings between the CARB board of directors and the EJAC so that they could engage with each other and ask questions and really roll up their shirt sleeves and work together on policy. Another model with our scientific advisory council is that we have a board member who is the liaison to the council. In the past, it's been the chair of our board who has done that, but our current chair is actually open to other board members playing that liaison role. But it is important, I think, for us to have a liaison so that when the two are not meeting together, there is somebody who can relay what happened to the board, or a board member who can relay that. And then it's important to have regular reports and updates to the board, which I'm sure you're already thinking of. Next slide, please. So I mentioned some of our informal and our ad hoc groups. We certainly do focus groups. Our design teams are typically a fully voluntary group of people who come together to advise us on town hall meetings that we might be putting together, on issues that they want our scientific advisory council to weigh in on. We have a number of informal groups like that. Some of them exist for a year or more. Some of them come together for just 1 or 2 meetings. Those groups, we might, again, be groups that we give gift cards to, but in some cases, stipends. We have technical working groups who help us on discrete policy issues, and we have resource teams that advise us on our spare the air work. And our resource teams, there's one for each of the 9 Bay Area counties. So we do have some flexibility. Not every group that advises us is, on par with our community steering committees or with our advisory council. So we do have that flexibility. I think I have one more slide. I think that's it. If you can go to the next slide. Yes, I wanted to share my contact information with you, but I am here happy to answer any questions that you might have. And again, as I said, really happy to keep you all in the loop as we finalize things like our stipend policy that might be helpful to you.
Thank you, Veronica. Are there any questions from the commission? None? Okay, I have 2, which is how do you establish a non-Brown Act committee and maintain transparency?
Well, I should say that, first of all, not everybody, particularly with the AB 617 work, not all of the lawyers agreed on which of them, or whether or not they should be Brown Act committees or not. And we weren't really getting that kind of advice from CARB because CARB is subject to Bagley-Keene and not necessarily an expert on the Brown Act. But the big factor, based on what our lawyers advised us at the Air District, is that in order for it to be a Brown Act committee, it needed to be appointed by the board. That's the big defining factor. Although I will say that for our other steering committees, certainly for West Oakland, and we're hopefully putting together a steering committee in East Oakland soon, we do strive to adhere to everything that the Brown Act requires. So the noticing, avoiding quorums and things like that. Although I will say in West Oakland, we do have subcommittees, but we try to keep them sub-quorum size. Those are the main factors. But in practice, I will say that the difference between a Brown Act committee and a non-Brown Act committee makes a really big difference for our staff. So in West Oakland, we have, the staff that are assigned to work in West Oakland, and they partner, 50-50 with a community-based organization, West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project. And our staff and West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project conduct those meetings jointly. So, and under a partnership agreement that West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project pulled together and developed. With respect to Richmond San Pablo, as I said, it does have a big staff burden on it. So, the clerk who runs our board meetings actually now has to come to these evening meetings that we have with the steering committee. Our contractor who runs our Brown Act, our board meetings for us, we need to have them engaged to run those meetings. We have an internal process, as I'm sure other agencies, the transportation agencies have, for reviewing our agendas, reviewing presentations, and then getting those posted to the internet. And so internally, for our executive staff who have to go through and approve all of the agendas and the memos and things like that, creates work for us internally. So I would say that in terms of transparency and accountability, I don't think in spirit that there is that much of a difference, but there is a big difference in terms of workload. Now, having said that, I'm saying this to you that I don't think that there's that big of a difference in terms of transparency and accountability. The community, on the other hand, thinks that there is a big difference, and they want to ensure that that light is being shined on the Air District and the work that we do. And they asked for a Brown Act committee because they wanted to make sure that there was that backstop. So internally for us, we feel like our work is transparent. We're adhering to the Brown Act, but it's really more about the community and making sure that they feel that they're assured of transparency.
Okay, well, we have public comment. So you want to go ahead and Douglas and line them up?
Yes, thank you, Vice Chair Alvarado. We have 2 written comments at this time with 1 attendee as well with their hand raised. I'll start with the written comments. The first comes from Christina. She asks, will the advisory body have any sort of decision-making power? Are they strictly advising? Thank you.
Is that question for me?
Yes, all the questions will be for you, Veronica.
Oh, all of the questions. Okay. So in terms of decision making, it really depends on the program. So, and it depends on what the board and the executive officer want. So with respect to our AB 617 Brown Act committee, we do rely on that body to make decisions. So they're putting together an emission reduction plan. They'll make decisions on what those strategies are to reduce emissions in the footprint of that work in Richmond and San Pablo. So the answer to that is yes. With respect to the Community Advisory Council that we're pulling together, the board and the executive staff will have, we're already keeping a list of things that we want that body to advise us on. So they will advise us on policy issues like AB 617, but we are looking to them, for example, the executive officer and the board have decided that they want to create a funding program called a Community Benefits Fund. We've actually not developed that program yet because we want the Community Advisory Council to play a key role in pulling that program together. So what I envision is that they may not directly be telling us what to do, but I see a collaborative process where the staff and the Community Advisory Council are working together to develop programs and policy work, and those things will then go to the board for a final decision where it's appropriate for the board to make a final decision. But we do envision sharing power with the CAC.
Next question, Doug.
Thank you. The next comment comes from Angelo Logan. He writes, a good practice to engage and build positive relationship is to use local community organizations as conveners, facilitators, and outreach consultants. Investing in community groups rather than big corporate firms is an important indication of understanding community and is a sign of good faith in investing in community. Thank you. And so we have one attendee with their hand raised at this time. We have Mike Garabedian. Mike, you're unmuted and free to make your comment. Okay, so it seems that was a mistake. We have no other attendees with their hand raised at this time. Thank you.
Mr. Vice Chair, if I may just comment on Angelo Logan's comment.
Sure.
I really appreciate him making that comment, and we certainly at the Air District have learned. Firstly, I should say that, you know, CARB has dictated with the way that AB 617 runs that there is a neutral facilitator running those processes. I can't say across the state that whether or not there have been neutral facilitation, but I will say that in our experience in the Bay Area, we hired a facilitator. We went through a process with that facilitator, and the community members of the steering committees told us that they weren't comfortable with that facilitator. So we actually did have to go back to the drawing board and work with the community and the rest of the steering committee to find a facilitator that they had trust in. So I appreciate that. That's a best practice that I didn't mention, and a really important part of the work.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Veronica, for your time. And Chair Norton, meeting's back to you.
Thank you so much, Vice Chair Alvarado. I really appreciate you running the meeting. With that, I'm excited to have us go back to item 16, the update on SB1 program guidelines development. Matthew?
Thank you, Chair Norton. I am just going to switch my notes over. One moment. Okay, and thank you, Chair Norton, and good afternoon, commissioners. Tab 16 is an information item to present an update on the Senate Bill 1 competitive program guidelines development. I would briefly like to cover some of the workshops we've already held and provide a preview of some program proposals on the horizon. On October 24th, we held our kickoff all SB1 competitive program workshop, in which we had over 340 virtual attendees. We covered program overviews, our plan for the workshop process, and previewed some of our overarching proposals for the programs moving forward. Also, on the heels of the August Commission Resolution G2160, which directed staff to work towards updating the appropriate program guidelines to address implementing relevant commission-led climate action plan for transportation infrastructure strategies, we introduced each commission-led CAPTI strategy and explained how each strategy would be addressed at upcoming workshops. Since the all program kickoff workshop, we've held one program-specific workshop for each program back in September as well. Recordings of those workshops and workshop materials can all be found on the Commission's workshop website. There are several upcoming proposals outlined in the book item, of which I would like to focus on a few right now. For all 3 programs, we will now offer the availability of the Performance Metrics Guidebook, which is an instructional guide for how applicants can calculate each of the program's required project performance metrics. The programs have been collecting required project outcomes, which we're now referring to as performance metrics, since cycle 1 of our programs. This guidebook was developed in partnership with Caltrans and several regional agency subject matter experts through a collaborative working group which lasted roughly 7 months. While the guidebook doesn't require a specific methodology for calculating each performance metric, it is meant to point towards professionally used and easily accessible methodologies or modeling tools for agencies who either don't have access or resources for their own tools or would prefer to utilize something outlined in the guidebook. The release of the guidebook is the most comprehensive guide we've covered, or I should say we've offered towards calculating the metrics, and we do plan to revisit and update the guidebook with each subsequent program cycle. We will be covering the guidebook in greater detail in an upcoming workshop for each program. Another proposal for all 3 programs as we move forward in this current guidelines development process will be the integration of equity and how it will factor into project selection. We understand that this is an extremely broad concept, but we are seeking real ways to augment existing evaluation criteria or consider a standalone equity evaluation criteria to further our program's consideration of transportation outcomes that are more equitable. This extremely important effort will involve close collaboration with our planning team at the Commission, as well as our stakeholders, and we'll kick off with an update I will be giving to the Commission's Equity Advisory Roundtable on October 28th, and continuing with an equity-focused workshop for all 3 programs to be announced shortly. Now, I want to share a few program-specific proposals which the Commission has been considering and are also in alignment with the CAPTI. As Mitch mentioned during his director's remarks, the Trade Corridor Enhancement Program made zero-emission freight infrastructure eligible for program funding in our program guidelines during the last program cycle. We're taking this a step further this cycle, and also in alignment with CAPTI Strategy 1.4, we will be exploring how to integrate zero-emission vehicle infrastructure projects within the program's evaluation criteria. This will be an agenda topic during the Trade Corridor Enhancement Program workshop next Thursday, October 21st. In the Solutions for Congested Corridors program, we will explore the better prioritization of projects that provide travelers with options to opt out of congestion, which is in alignment with CAPTI Strategy 1.1. We will start exploring options with our stakeholders during the next Congested Corridors workshop, which will be on October 29th. Also in the Congested Corridors program, and on a path we set in cycle 2 of that program, and in alignment with CAPTI Strategy 1.2, we will be requiring that comprehensive multimodal corridor plans are in direct alignment with the corridor plan guidelines. This was a topic that we already discussed during the September 28th Congested Corridors workshop. We will also explore how to evaluate corridor plans in an upcoming Congested Corridors workshop as well. And in both the Local Partnership Program and the Solutions for Congested Corridors program, we will explore ways to integrate pro-housing principles into each program's existing efficient land use criteria. The California Department of Housing and Community Development implemented their pro-housing designation program over the summer, and as a nod to our commitment to achieve mutually desired outcomes in our partnership with HCD, as well as in alignment with CAPTI Strategy 7.1, we will look for ways to update these evaluation criteria accordingly. We plan to discuss the integration of pro-housing principles with HCD's participation at our Local Partnership Program and Congested Corridors Program workshops currently scheduled in November. So that will be in the next workshops after the ones next week. This just summarizes a few of the proposals we have on the horizon for our programs, but others are outlined in the book item, as I mentioned, and others are planned for upcoming workshops as well. We aim to post workshop agendas at least 10 days prior to each program workshop so that stakeholders know in advance which topics will be discussed at each upcoming workshop. These agendas and associated workshop materials can be found on the Commission's workshop site, and you can actually find materials for LPP, TCEP, and the Congested Corridors workshops are occurring over the next week and a half on the website right now. The Cycle 3 guidelines development will last for several more months, and we're aiming to bring draft guidelines to the Commission at the June 2022 Commission meeting. We plan to hold roughly one program workshop a month through April, and we will aim to get 2022 save the dates posted in the coming weeks. At this time, I will close my remarks and open it up for any feedback or questions from our commissioners.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I know we have Commissioner Liu who wishes to speak, and we do not have any public comment at this time. So,
Thank you, Chair Norton. Thanks, Matt, for that presentation. It's a little unenviable task to sort of take already developed guidelines and now try to layer back into them the CAPTI and equity objectives that we have. I know it's not easy, and it's a tricky undertaking. So I want to acknowledge in advance that I recognize it's challenging. I'm glad you guys are trying to do this, and I fully support it. I am a little concerned as to how well projects are going to be aligned with CAPTI as they come up through the process, and how we're going to get projects that are fully aligned with CAPTI kind of into the pipeline and prioritized and moving forward. But that's probably a longer conversation to have on another day. I'd like to ask some questions about the guidebook, because I think I pay attention to what's going on here, but this guidebook kind of caught me off guard. I really didn't know that it was being developed. I didn't even understand that how far along it had been, that 7 months had been put into it. I'm not aware of any public stakeholder outreach effort. I'm a little concerned that it's going to be framed as going down the road of, decide, announce, defend policymaking or guidebook development. And I do think, especially when it comes to CAPTI and equity issues, we have to be real careful about that. So I'd like to know, what's the process from here? Is there going to be a formal effort to get feedback from stakeholders, and are we open to comments and questions from people in order to be flexible enough to not kind of dictate what's going to be used and how it's going to be used in terms of the guidebook? I'm not against the principle of having common data sets and things like that. I think it can be helpful. It's just that as commissioner, I kind of was surprised at how far along it was, and don't remember having heard anything about it. So thank you.
No, Commissioner Liu, I really appreciate that question. I think it's a good one. So if you don't mind, I'm going to just take a slight step back and give you a bit of the background on the performance metrics, which we used to call benefits. I think in cycle 1, we realized that a lot of the data we pulled are actually not beneficial, such as GHG emissions. So we referred to them as project outcomes. And now with cycle 3, we've landed on performance metrics. So this has been an iterative process where in cycle 1, we didn't offer any tools or methodologies, I think, outside of the CalBC model, which is quite frankly, has a very specific purpose and use. And we can maybe expand upon that in certain metrics, but certainly not all. And we put it on applicants to utilize their own methodologies to give us, a set of outcomes or a set of benefits. In cycle 2, Laura Penny-Baker actually led an effort to develop more of a consistent and uniform set of performance outputs. But I still believe we did not offer like a menu of options to applicants to calculate these outputs. And so I want to say that this effort was initiated back at the close of cycle 2 guidelines, where we realized we would have to take on a working group effort to pull in regional subject matter experts and professionals. And so it was actually a contract, I believe, with partnership with Caltrans, kind of kicked off this guidebooks process back in maybe December 2020. And I would turn to Hannah Walter. She's been leading this effort on my team. Unfortunately, she's out at a deposition today, so I will do the best I can, Commissioner, in answering your question about what the next steps are, but I would certainly be willing to sit and chat with you about this a bit further as well. So Hannah led an effort with Caltrans and subject matter experts for 7 months, like I mentioned, around the performance metrics that have been identified and required in the program since cycle 1. They've been honed in cycle 2, and they've been a bit further honed in cycle 3, but for the most part, I believe they are the same identified metrics that we had in cycle 2. We have identified some newer information areas, newer to the programs, but not new, such as equity, climate change adaptation, accessibility, and public health, which actually will be fleshed out fully through our guidelines process. So those don't live in the guidebook necessarily as prescribed metrics, such as they're just outlined, and we will flesh them out with a public dialogue, you know, in terms of how we can quantify them, if they can be quantified, or qualitatively ask for that information. So that's still entirely open-ended to be discussed during this cycle. In terms of the rest of the guidebook, I do want to, you know, underline that it is a considered menu of options for applicants to use. It is not prescribing any one way to quantify a metric. The metrics themselves are required to be provided to us. Some of them are required for certain programs and are evaluated in certain programs, but that's all explained in, I think we have like a crosswalk in the beginning of the guidebook. So I guess we will be bringing the guidebook to program workshops. We have to determine how to fit that into our existing kind of agenda for the programs, but they will be introduced to our stakeholders for input and feedback. But what I would say is, at this point in time, you know, I don't know that there will be an augmentation to the existing guidebook in cycle 3, simply because we're not necessarily prescribing those methodologies to be used. Understanding the fact that we continue to get better information every day, and we understand we will be absolutely opening this up again in the subsequent cycle, and, you know, maybe augmenting or changing options that we've made available to our applicants in the guidebook itself. So it's less of a rule book and more of an instructional guide.
Okay, that explanation helps a lot, and I know that Mitch is committed to bringing staff together to brief me on it. And I think when we do that, we can talk more about the substantive, you know, parts of it, because you did a really good job of explaining where it is and how it got here. And I'm glad to hear, you know, I mean, that explanation, that's been helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Matthew did a good job of explaining the history and how this is, you know, are things that have been talked about since cycle 2, and talking about how we'll be rolling this out so people have a chance to comment about it. The one thing that is just going to be inherent in how the process is being done, and this is evolving, is we're always going to kind of be a cycle behind in terms of developing a lot of detail on the metrics and the developing of the guidelines. As we adopt the guidelines, there won't be time necessarily to incorporate new changes in the most up-to-date version of the guidebook. But our goal is really to give people tools and to help us be able to answer questions.
Chair
Sorry,
Norton, is it
yes.
okay?
Commissioner Davis, sorry, I turned off my volume when I sneezed, so forgot to put it back on. Commissioner Davis, the floor is yours.
As of Friday, for 44 years, my wife's been turning off the volume, so I'm quite used to it. No problem. No, Matthew, I just wanted to thank you and the entire team for the work you did on this, a difficult process. Also just wanted to take the time to thank you guys for as you're working to try to figure out how we dovetail where we can, and with CAPTI, that we remember, what we sold the public on SB1, and the work that you're doing there to protect the integrity of what we sold to taxpayers. At the same time, we're trying to figure out how we take care of climate issues in the state. So as Commissioner Liu said, difficult task, tough job, and you guys did great work. And I just wanted to thank you for that work.
Thank you, Commissioner Davis. I know you're not asking me a question, but I'm incredibly proud of my team. I have a very professional and hardworking team, and they have an immense task upon them for this cycle. I think this certainly has been a lot of important changes that we've been understanding, are needed in our programs, and we have a lot of learning and a lot of, I think, growing and challenges that I can tell you my team is very eager and capable to take on. So I appreciate the comment.
Thank you. And thank you for the staff's participation to make sure that we're broadening the number of people in the room having input on the guidelines themselves. So thank you. This is a big task. There's a lot to do, a lot of input to sift through. So we appreciate you taking the time to really explain to people what the process is and where it's going to go. So thank you. I see that we have no public comment. Any other commissioners who wish to speak on this item? If not, we will go to item 19. Thank you so much, Matthew. Laura? Wonderful.
Good afternoon, commissioners. Can you hear me okay?
We sure can.
Awesome. All right. So tab 19 is an informational item. And Marlon Flournoy, who is Caltrans Division Chief for Transportation Planning, is going to present an overview of the final 2021 Interregional Transportation Strategic Plan, or the ITSP. The ITSP is a long-range planning document that provides a vision for investing in California's interregional transportation system to support the movement of people and goods. At the August Commission meeting, Caltrans presented an overview of the draft ITSP, and the Commission formally submitted comments on September 10th. Commission comments focused on the need for the plan to better identify needs for each strategic corridor, more clearly address the individual needs of each interregional corridor, to expand discussion around projected freight demand and meeting throughput needs, and to strengthen the Interregional Transportation Improvement Program, or ITIP, scoring criteria related to equity. On October 5th, Caltrans issued a written response to Commission comments, which has been included in the Commission meeting book. So with that context, I'd now like to hand it over to Marlon to provide an overview of the final plan and to discuss how Commission comments were considered.
Good afternoon. Can you guys hear me okay?
We sure can.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Madam Chair, Vice Chair Alvarado, commissioners, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you about the final 2021 Interregional Transportation Strategic Plan, or the ITSP. We finalized and released the document on October the 1st, 2021, and I would like to briefly acknowledge my team for doing such a wonderful job of getting the document out for public review on August the 2nd. Conducting 3 workshops within the month of August, meeting individually with stakeholders, both in rural and urban areas, reviewing more than 400 individual comments from government and non-governmental organizations, and making all the needed edits to the document and getting it finalized by our deadline of October 1st. And so they just did a phenomenal job. And I also want to just take a moment to thank CTC staff for their partnership throughout the process. And finally, but not least, I want to thank Caltrans executive team and the administration for their support. So that's just been really important. All right, so next slide. All right, so the ITSP is one of the 6 modal plans that implements the California Transportation Plan 2050, and it draws from and aligns with the California Rail Plan, as well as the California Freight Mobility Plan. The plan's updated every 5 years, and it's consistent with CTP development cycle. And the ITSP is a planning document that provides policy direction on interregional travel during the development of the ITIP, but it also helps inform other interregional investment decisions. And one of the main pieces of the ITSP is the scoring criteria for the ITIP. And I'll talk a little bit about that later in the presentation. Next slide. All right, so the ITSP defines interregional travel as long distance trips that facilitate the movement of people and goods between two or more regions. And you see the two maps here that show the major regions throughout the state. It has key regional connectors as well as the strategic interregional corridors. And since connecting the regions is a priority for the ITSP, we it's sort of the some and we also on regional corridors where proposed international connection.
Mr. Flournoy, we are really having a difficult time hearing you, and your screen has just frozen.
Oh.
Do you want to turn off your video so that you can have more clear audio?
All right, can you hear me now?
We can hear you perfectly. And if you could go back to talking about this slide from the beginning, because we heard nothing.
Oh, my apologies. I'm sorry about that. Okay, so this current slide or the last slide?
Probably the last slide. I can speak for myself that I really couldn't hear it. It was a little garbled.
Okay, if you can just go back one slide.
There you go.
Okay, great. All right, so the ITSP, defines the interregional travel as long distance trips that facilitate the movement of people and goods between two or more regions. Actually, wrong talking point, sorry. So it's one of 6 modal plans that implements the California Transportation Plans, and it draws from and aligns with the California State Rail Plan as well as the Freight Mobility Plan. The plan is updated every 5 years, so it's timed with the California Transportation Plan development cycle, which is developed every 5 years. And the ITSP is a planning document that provides a policy framework for interregional travel during the development of the ITIP, but also helps informs other interregional investment decisions. And another major piece of the document is the ITIP scoring criteria. And I'll talk a little bit about that later in the presentation. Next slide. All right. The ITSP, it defines interregional travel as long distance trips that facilitate the movement of people and goods between two or more regions. And the two maps here basically show the major regions throughout California, and also it includes the key regional connections, as well as the state strategic and regional corridors. Since connecting regions is a priority for the ITSP, we had to define the regions in which are on the map on the left, and then on the map on the right shows the strategic and regional corridors, which are the major and regional connections between the regions. Next slide. All right, so within the strategic and regional corridors, we've defined priority interregional facilities, and that includes both railroads and highways that facilitate the movement of people and goods between the regions. And these facilities serve as the primary multimodal connections between two or more regions. One of the things that I'll point out, and I'll talk a little bit more about it in another slide, but the ITSP, it did add 4 priority interregional facilities. Interstate 8, which transverses the California-Mexico border, Interstate 40, which provides a vital connection between California and Arizona, US 50, which provides access to the Tahoe Basin, and then State Route 32, which provides a key connection between the Bay Area and the Central Valley via Interstate 580. Next slide. All right, so this graphic shows how the ITSP is aligned with other policy documents and funding programs. So the top row, it shows the Climate Action Plan for Transportation Infrastructure. It also shows the CTP 2050. And as you all know, these documents do provide the policy framework for Caltrans to implement. Then we have the 6 plans that implement the above policy documents. The ITSP is highlighted in orange here. And the 2 plans next to the ITSP are the State Rail Plan and the Freight Mobility Plan. And they do help complement the ITSP because we're pulling rail and freight strategies out of those plans. Next, we have the corridor plans, which should be aligning with the ITSP high-level strategies that are identified, and I'll talk a little bit about that in another slide. Identifying needs and solutions for specific corridors within the interregional strategic corridors. And then on the bottom are all the different funding programs. And so I'd already mentioned the ITSP provides, sort of key, policy direction in regards to, the ITIP. But we also do utilize the ITSP to help inform other investment decisions via these other programs. Next slide. All right, so getting to the meat of the presentation here. So some of the key changes, one of the big changes in the document includes us actually streamlining it a bit. The 2015 document was about 183 pages. This version is about 70 pages. And of course, it's in alignment with all the different policy drivers. And one of the things I did want to point out is that we did coordinate with the Governor's Office of Planning and Research on their Regions Rise Together initiative, which lays out a vision for inclusive and sustainable economic development across California's diverse and interconnected regions. I had previously mentioned that we've added 4 new routes. And also just wanted to acknowledge that the plan does really get into talking about the fact that the transportation system contributes the greatest share of climate changing greenhouse gas emissions, and while also playing a vital role in climate adaptation resilience. And so the interregional system does play an important role in facilitating evacuations, as we all know, with the wildfires and other natural disasters. And so the ITSP does promote strategies to meet the state's climate adaptation goals, greenhouse gas emission goals, as well as vehicle miles travel reduction goals. Also, the ITSP, I mentioned it aligns with CAPDI, and that includes the scoring criteria. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a few seconds here. But we wanted to make sure that we're emphasizing supporting a freight mode shift to reduce VMT, also reducing the impact of interregional facilities and trips on communities and natural resources. And the scoring criteria includes a range that accounts for the degree to which different regions and different modes can accomplish these goals. Lastly, and I wanted just to express the fact that this ITSP is aligned with Caltrans equity statement. So we have some information in there which acknowledges that communities of color and underserved communities have historically experienced fewer benefits and greater share of negative impacts associated with the state's transportation system. And so we wanted to make sure that the document acknowledged that, but also as we're selecting projects, it has that equity lens. Next slide.
That's great.
All right, so for the just the general layout, and I'm not going to spend much time on this, but the setup of the document, we have chapter 1 that focuses on providing the overview of California and the interregional transportation system. The second chapter focuses more on the policies, so CAPDI and CTP 2050, and really laying out a vision and the goals and objectives of the ITSP. The third chapter really gets into the 11 strategic interregional corridors. And then we have a series of appendices which include the scoring criteria. Next slide. All right, so the goals that are in the ITSP are the same goals that are in CTP. So we wanted to make sure that we have that consistency, and basically we're providing an interregional lens as it relates to each of these goals. Next slide. All right, and so as I mentioned, we have 11 interregional strategic corridors. And so in that chapter 3, we have basically a strategy for each of those corridors, which includes a map, a summary of the corridors, as well as a set of strategies and improvements, you know, for the priority interregional facilities that Caltrans will use during the corridor planning process, and to provide direction on the identification of projects and system improvements. And so, you know, one of the things, and I'll mention this toward the end of the presentation, but, you know, we do acknowledge that, you know, these are all high-level summaries and strategies, and it is our intent to, you know, work with our districts, stakeholders, both in the regions, and also, you know, other interested parties on developing an addendum that really digs a little bit deeper in terms of, you know, some of the sort of the context, the context sort of sensitive and specific strategies within each of the corridors. Next slide. All right, so the ITIP scoring criteria. So there are 15 scoring criteria that are in the ITIP, and they align with the categories that are identified in the slide. There are 2 criteria that are sort of threshold criteria, which identify whether or not the projects support an interregional corridor or facility, identify it in the ITSP. And then the remaining 13 evaluate how well the project accomplishes the goals of the ITSP and CTP. And then the projects, and I just wanted to make a note here, the projects are scored between 0 and 3 points for each criteria, and are weighed equally. There was a typo in the ITSP document regarding the point scale, and that has since been corrected. Next slide. Okay, so just wanted to briefly talk about the comments that we got from the staff, and we really appreciate the thoughtful comment letter, and we're going to continue to coordinate with the CTC staff, you know, throughout the process here. Many of the comments identified in the comment letter were incorporated in the final document, including the importance of seaports and fuel cell technology, you know, focus on equity, emergency evacuation routes, economic benefits, as well as safety and the scoring criteria. And there were also a number of smaller clarifying comments that were addressed. There were some of the comments that spoke to, you know, how we were handling transitions between interregional routes, and how we're identifying freight needs in specific corridors. And so recognizing that every corridor and route are different, we definitely recognize that there's a need to do further analysis. But I also wanted to point out much of the important work on the ground and the context, you know, driven analyses and the needs identification, you know, really is a part of that comprehensive multimodal corridor planning process, which are done in partnership between Caltrans districts, local and regional agencies, as well as stakeholders. Next slide. And that gets into the addendum that I wanted to briefly talk about. The CTC staff did request, you know, more detailed analysis for the 11 strategic and regional corridors to identify things such as safety, mode choice, goods movement, and the climate change adaptation needs. And so recognizing that, you know, that is something that we're going to be kicking off. We're going to start that work in the coming months with the goal of wrapping that up by the end of December 2022. And the addendum will be done in partnership with the districts, state agencies such as CTC, as well as local and regional partners and stakeholders in the public. And so we'll be digging a little bit deeper in regards to those 11 corridors and really seeking out strategies that can help us meet the goals that have been identified. And with that said, next slide. Appreciate you allowing me to come and talk to you about the status of the ITSP, and happy to answer any questions that you guys have.
Wonderful. Justin, is there any public comment on this item?
Chair Norton, I see no public comment at this time. Thank you.
Okay, and commissioners, do any of you wish to ask questions on the ITSP? Okay, well, Commissioner Eager.
Yes, I just had one quick question. You mentioned that you had been working with the group from the Regions Rise Together, and certainly that's an important group to look at inland California and how that's a little bit different than the western part of the United States. And I was just wondering what additional insights you got from working with that group, and would you continue doing that in the future?
Yeah, most certainly. So just to clarify, it was the staff at OPR that we coordinated with. But I think some of the insight that we got is that, we really need to be thinking about this from an economic standpoint in regards to how we're viewing these facilities, providing, connections to jobs and services, that really help provide some of the benefits, to the disadvantaged communities that really historically been disconnected. And so, that I think some of the insight that we have, but most certainly moving forward, we're going to continue. I would say we sort of scratched the surface in this plan, but digging a little bit deeper in terms of the 11 corridors, we're certainly going to do more of engagement to make sure that we're factoring those pieces in.
Great, thank you. As an economic developer from one of those areas that gets left behind a lot, I just want to let you know how much I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's my understanding that we now do have public comment. Thank you very much, Commissioner Eager, for your insightful question. Justin?
Thank you, Chair Norton. I see one attendee with their hand raised at this time. We have Patricia Chen.
Thank you. This is Patricia Chen from LA Metro. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank the Commission for their attention and the work that they've done with Caltrans to make this a better plan. And I would like to thank Caltrans staff for meeting with us and speaking very candidly and really helping us to understand how these things work. And I did also want to share that we submitted a comment letter directly to Caltrans in September. And I wanted to share a few points from it, if that's okay. Thank you. We feel that freight is a very important part of the state transportation planning scene right now. And indeed, it is shown to be, it's emphasized in the ITSP, rightly so. And unfortunately, there are not strategic routes that connect directly to the ports in LA and Long Beach, which are, serving 40% of the national freight. And there's so much truck travel coming out of that. Truck VMT is slated to increase 72% by 2050. And so we would love to continue working with you this time and into the future to do what we can with state resources to focus on this very important issue. Also, in the STIP guidelines, it talks about eligibility for active transportation programs in the STIP, and as well as specifically states that for the ITIP. And so we've been working a little bit on this to make sure that these projects can really get a fair shake and really score well. And we'd like to continue working on that because with the CAPTI now, it's very important to be multimodal in everything that we do. And so we look forward on that. And we look forward on just that CAPTI focus for the ITSP and for the scoring criteria ultimately for the ITIP to really go to work on climate and equity issues. So with that, those are my comments, and I thank you very much for your consideration.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Really appreciate it. Justin, does that conclude the public comment on these items?
Yes, Chair Norton. I see no other attendees indicating they wish to make public comment at this time. Thank you.
Great. With that, we'll go to item 20, and that is actually the adoption of the 2021 Interregional Transportation Strategic Plan.
Thank you, Chair Norton. Yes, tab 20 is an action item and staff does recommend your approval of the 2021 ITSP. I did want to note that we greatly appreciate Caltrans addressing many of the Commission's comments in the final plan. And I also want to highlight that working in coordination with Commission staff, Caltrans is going to address other comments over time as they advance interregional corridor planning across the state and as they prepare that addendum, which I did want to note will be provided to us at the end of next year.
Fantastic.
So with that, staff does recommend your approval, and I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have on our end.
Okay, commissioners, do you have any questions, or would you like to make a motion to approve as recommended?
So moved, Madam Chairman.
Okay, Davis moves, Lou seconds. Douglas, could you please read the roll?
Commissioner Alvarado,
Yes, sir.
Commissioner Davis,
Aye.
Commissioner Eager,
Aye.
Commissioner Falcone,
Aye.
Commissioner Grisby,
Aye.
Commissioner Guardino,
Aye.
Commissioner Inman, Commissioner Liu,
Aye.
Commissioner Martinez,
Aye.
Commissioner Tavaloni,
Aye.
Chair Norton.
Aye.
Chair, the motion is approved.
Thank you so much. We'll move to item 21, the Caltrans update on statewide climate vulnerability assessment and climate adaptation plans. Marlon, great to see you again. And is Kiran joining us? Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Norton. Good afternoon, Commissioners. Tab 21 is an informational item. Caltrans' Division of Transportation Planning Chief, Marlon Flournoy. He will be presenting an update on Caltrans' climate change planning efforts to the Commission. And specifically, Marlon will be sharing key updates regarding the climate vulnerability assessments, which were finalized in October of 2019, and the climate adaptation priority reports finalized in February 2021. Marlon, thank you again for being here to share these updates, and we look forward to your presentation.
Okay, appreciate the opportunity again. So good afternoon again. Yeah, I just wanted to share a little bit about what's going on in terms of our climate change planning efforts. And so, Karen, I'm glad that you mentioned the vulnerability assessment and adaptation priority reports, and I'll dig a little bit more into that. But also, I want to talk to you today in terms of how we're utilizing those reports and efforts to inform other processes within Caltrans and integrating that into our planning and project development processes, next steps. So next slide. All right, so California is seeing an increased climate change related to impacts along the state highway system. These events will only become more severe and more frequent through the end of the century. Caltrans is legislatively mandated to consider climate change, both the GHG reduction and adaptation through mandates such as Assembly Bill 32, various executive orders, as well as SB1. The district climate change vulnerability assessments identify portions of the state highway system vulnerable to 6 climate stressors. And so we have change in temperature, change in precipitation, wildfires, sea level rise, storm surge, and cliff retreat. The district vulnerability assessments also identify 4 key asset types, which include roadways, bridges, large culverts, and small culverts, anticipated to be impacted by different climate stressors as a result of projected future climate conditions. And the data that we've collected from these endeavors, they're available on our website. And so I'll be more than happy to share that information. And that's going to help inform project level decisions, as well as to identify district specific issues. And lastly, the vulnerability assessments will be used at a statewide level to better understand how the center lane miles and the state highway system will be affected by climate change through 2100, excuse me. Next slide. All right, so for the vulnerability assessments, each district was, work with our consultant to deliver 4 deliverables. And so there's a summary report, which provides an overview of the natural environment, the transportation infrastructure, and the interaction between the transportation system and the identified stressors. There's also a technical report that provides background on data used to develop the reports, including the vulnerability assessment methodology. There's also an ArcGIS online web map, which is on our website, and it's a tool that allows users to toggle stressors on and off to visualize different locations and stressors. And lastly, the statewide vulnerability assessment summary report. So this provides an overview and a synopsis of the results of the 12 district vulnerability assessments and highlights Caltrans plan next steps. And all this information is available on our website. Next slide. All right, so a diverse and varied geographic landscape leads to California being susceptible to many different climate stressors. The central regions will experience sea level rise, storm surge, and cliff retreat. Inland areas were found to be generally more susceptible to wildfire and increases in temperature. A diverse and varied geographic landscape leads California to being susceptible to many more different stressors. Some of the examples that I want to cite in District 2, which is in Northern California, they basically have the greatest wildfire exposure with over 1,500 miles of the state highway system passing through medium, high, or very high exposure areas by the end of the century. By the year 2100, 160 miles of highway will be affected by sea level rise statewide. And I want to also point out in the San Francisco Bay Area, it accounts for 60% of that. So about 94 miles in the Bay Area are impacted by sea level rise. And then in Northern and Central California, they're most susceptible to cliff retreat. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to switch gears here and talk about the adaptation priority reports. So the vulnerability assessments focused on the climate stressors and the nexus between those climate stressors and the assets. The adaptation priority reports really do focus on the assets, and it identifies the vulnerabilities within the districts and prioritizes them based off on exposure. So how likely an event is to happen, and then consequence, the magnitude of the event that would actually have on transportation. Vulnerable assets were prioritized based off of technical data analysis and verified by Caltrans staff as well as local agency partners familiar with the assets identified as being at risk. And the adaptation priority reports, give Caltrans sort of a firm understanding of assets that are most susceptible to climate risk. And it also puts Caltrans in a position to, start thinking about nominating, climate adaptation projects, that will proactively adapt the state highway system for projected climate conditions and also mitigate impacts to assets with the highest climate risk and make the system more resilient. Next slide. So I did want to just talk a little bit about some of the takeaways with the adaptation priority reports. Completing those reports, it really concluded that a multi-step process is needed to understand climate change vulnerability along the state highway system. In the multi-step process, just as an example, we have these locations that are identified, right? So you might have a bridge that we know is going to be impacted by sea level rise. But what we really want to have to understand is, what does the scope of that project look like? There are probably a dozen different types of strategies that can be employed, to mitigate that sea level rise. And it's not a one size fits all. And so what we've discovered was that, we definitely need to start looking at developing some tools and guidance for our districts to be able to understand how to deal with these assets and the impacts of climate change. We also learned that organizing and prioritizing our asset list can actually feed to nominating new projects that directly address climate, but it really is a funding issue. So just as an example, with the SHOP program, we might have a roadway that needs to be rehabilitated. If we need to mitigate with sea level rise, that definitely, exceeds the projected, funding that we thought would be available. And so we want to make sure that, that we're understanding where the needs out there, but also at the same time, thinking about how to adequately fund those pieces. All right, next slide. All right, so just in terms of next steps, and I had alluded to this, but so Caltrans, we are developing a statewide adaptation priority report that would prioritize vulnerabilities at the statewide level and focus on investment in California's most vulnerable assets. The statewide prioritization data, which is already available, but what we want to do is actually overlay that with data associated with equity and disadvantaged communities, because we really need to be thinking, we have some of these assets and we're based off of consequences and exposure, but we also have to add that equity layer onto it and really be thinking about the most vulnerable communities throughout the state to help sort of refine that prioritization. We also need to make sure that we're integrating climate change into Caltrans plans and programs, including the State Highway System Management Plan, corridor planning, freight planning, as well as some of the investment planning work that we have going on to prioritize, different projects as far as funding goes. As an example, we have a climate change emphasis guide as part of our corridor planning process. And then we also, have sea level rise incorporated into the 2021 SHSMP. Definitely the goal is to be thinking about how to get those other stressors into that document. So we're coordinating with our asset management group to be able to do that. And lastly, we want to make sure that we're continuing to develop guidance tools and training to help support this work. And also support CAPDI, because it does lay out how the state intends to utilize existing funding sources to address climate adaptation. So we want to make sure that we're continuing to support that. And I just wanted to at least talk about a little bit about the integration piece of this. So we've done a vulnerability assessment, which identifies the climate stressors, the adaptation priority reports that draw that link between the stressors and our assets. Then taking that information to help inform decision-making on the State Highway System Management Plan, but also our system planning and our corridor planning. And then the next step would be at the project level when we are developing our project initiation documents. So preparing those projects for programming, making sure that we have the correct scope, making sure that we have the right strategies to address the different stressors, And then in our project delivery process, making sure that we're providing the tools to help guide that work and to ensure that the project is adequately addressing the vulnerabilities and the climate stressors. And last slide. So with that said, I'm more than happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you. We do have questions. Commissioner Martinez has a question, and I believe we're going to have some public comment. And if there are other commissioners, please turn on your videos if you have questions to ask as well.
Thank you, Chairwoman Norton. I can't turn on my video. My laptop died today, so I'm on my phone. So my apologies. But my question for Marlon is, how is Caltrans engaging with local and regional agencies in studying the climate vulnerability and adaptation planning? And then my second is, how is Caltrans and the state preparing for emergency infrastructure failures or infrastructure that is compromised due to climate change events?
Okay, yeah. For the first question, so when we developed the vulnerability assessments and the adaptation priority reports, you know, we did work with our district offices, and I know there was some coordination, you know, definitely with the local agencies, you know, regarding the assets go. But you know, I would say that there's definitely an opportunity to make sure that we're doing more engagement, you know, with communities and community-based organizations. You know, really what we were trying to do is understand the issues from a global standpoint. But what I do foresee is, as we start doing more of the planning work on the ground, really, you know, digging into the strategies, we want to make sure that we're working with, you know, community-based organizations, local agencies, as well as the, you know, the actual, you know, residents and businesses that might be impacted, making sure that we're actually accounting for them in the process and taking their feedback. So yeah, definitely, I think more needs to be done in regards to that outreach. Yeah, we'll be working with the districts on that. And then for your second question, if you can just repeat that briefly again.
Yeah, no, of course. How is Caltrans and the state preparing for emergency infrastructure failures or infrastructure that is compromised due to climate change events?
Yeah. So part of that is understanding what are the facilities that are most vulnerable. And so we actually have a priority sort of scheme where we have you know, 5 different priority groups for each district. And so we have priority group 1, and that would be the assets that are most susceptible and are going to have the biggest impacts for climate. And so one of the things that we're trying to understand is, you know, we have all that data for each district. Now what we need to understand is roll all that up, and how do we prioritize it from a statewide perspective and really start targeting what are those facilities that are the most vulnerable, factoring in, you know, vulnerable communities. And so that's really, I think, part of the first step. And then the next step would be then to start thinking about, you know, what does the next set of projects look like to actually start moving that forward. But again, one of the challenges is funding, right? You know, we definitely operate within a financially constrained environment. And so, you know, we are looking at, you know, figuring out how to identify like different targets, you know, in the State Highway System Management Plan. So that's something that, you know, will definitely be explored in the future. And then our goal would be, you know, how to actually meet those targets, focusing on the most vulnerable assets.
Thank you for that, Marlon. I just wanted to, you know, make it clear, as, you know, we talk about equity, we're talking about timing and adaptation. We obviously know the state of California is massive, and, you know, each region is very different. For example, you know, my briefing with the OCTA the other day, you know, they have an adaptation plan, and they know, and we're going to be talking about this issue later as it pertains to MetroLink, but, climate and adaptation, as we talk about equity, and I hope that the Equity Roundtable will be able to move towards talking about these issues, in particular because of the governor's executive order and CAPDI. It's imperative that we understand, as I always have said in the past, that not every city is created equally, not every transportation agency is created equally. And if you look at Northern, Central, and just for example, in San Diego and Orange County are very different from the rest of the state. And I think we need to take that into consideration. And so as we talk about equity, as we talk about these priorities and these plans, that we take that into account. And because as I talked to OCTA, they put a plan together about 3 or 4 years ago. They received a grant. And to be quite honest with you, I was quite surprised that Orange County would move in that direction, but they are prepared. They have plans in place, and we should recognize that as we move forward. So I appreciate your comments and your presentation.
Thank you. And actually, Chair Norton, if there's one, I just want to add one piece to this. We do have our sustainable communities planning grant program. And we do, make funding available to communities for a variety of transportation planning related work, including climate change. And so, I think there's another opportunity there to work with communities, to identify, different types of infrastructure needs and planning needs. And so I just wanted to recognize that fact.
Thank you so much. Commissioner Inman.
I believe that my comments just kind of build on Commissioner Martinez, and it's really around resiliency. Marlon, if we look at the comments we received on the ITSP, it was mostly resiliency, I think was in almost every comment letter. And if you look at evacuation corridors, as Commissioner Martinez suggested, and resiliency. So I would hope that that would be a primary filter that you all would be applying, because unfortunately we have wildfire season every day of the year, and we've had example after example, and I think a lot of those letters that came into us were the very folks that needed to pile everything they could grab into their vehicle and get out. We have Metrolink has a section out of service today as we speak because of a climate change issue, in my opinion. And then if we look at the work that we've been trying to do around the freight corridors with the Army Corps of Engineers, their research team is really focused on resiliency in logistics and making sure that, and their project started with the military, making sure that our military would be able to continue. But I do think resiliency needs to be brought front and center with all of this planning, and make sure, because we talk about safety being our number one concern for all of us. And so for me, the evacuation routes, and they're happening every day. We've got 101 closed today as we speak. So I think for all of those, just if you can maybe pull resiliency filter front and center for that, I think we'll all be better. Thank you.
Oh, very good point. Commissioner Falcon, and then I believe we have a public comment. Commissioner Falcon, you're muted.
All right, I thought I was a pro already. Thank you so much, Chair. And thank you for your presentation, Marlon. This is a huge issue, obviously, in so many ways. And, just wanted to piggyback a bit on Commissioner Martinez's comments on equity. Absolutely, climate change has definitely affected different areas of California in different ways. Most dramatically in wildfire hotspots. Also had a question though, and I think you touched a little bit on it during your presentation on rail. Climate change has absolutely, impacted, the coastal rail corridors in Lausanne and Senator Kehoe, when she was a commissioner, really championed this in looking at a long-term solution to, to that really important connection that moves not only passengers but freight. And so is there any thought to including, the rail assessments of vulnerability of rail and potential solution of moving long-term that rail, along the highways?
I really appreciate that comment. In fact, we were having a conversation about this a couple of weeks ago. So when we wrapped up the vulnerability assessments, I can't believe it's already been 2 years since those have been wrapped up. And then even going back to when we kicked that process off, which was probably 2017, 16. I definitely think we were ahead of the curve back then. Unfortunately, at that time, we were focusing in on the state highway system, but we did recognize that we really need to be thinking about the complete transportation system. And so there is a need to refresh the data. I mentioned it's 2 years old. And so we're working through what that process looks like. And we are planning on making sure that rail facilities are going to be included into that next phase, of that data refresh, because that is important.
I appreciate that, Marlon, and I like that you're looking at things holistically. It is sort of ever changing and dynamic. This whole work that and responding to what's going on with climate change. So I appreciate that very much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Great comments, Commissioner Falcone. And I believe we have a public commenter who has some germane points to make today.
Thank you, Chair Norton. We have one attendee looking to make comment at this time. We have Darren Kettle. Darren, you're free to unmute yourself and make your comment.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair. Am I coming through okay? Are you hearing me clearly?
Very clear.
Very good. Very good. Thank you. So I'm Darren Kettle. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Metrolink, Southern California's passenger rail system that serves 6 counties in Southern California. And I appreciate this conversation. I want to thank Commissioner Martinez and Commissioner Inman for their comments regarding the rail line that connects San Diego and Los Angeles counties, the second busiest rail corridor in all of the country. That in my very first week on the job, I had to make the decision because of serious concerns about landslide issues that would take the railroad tracks into the Pacific Ocean were very serious and very apparent and very real, and obviously of great danger. So we did do that. We did take the line out of service. Nothing like your first week on the job having to make that decision, but we did. And but the point in all of this is over the course of the last several weeks, working in partnership with the Orange County Transportation Authority, the Burlington Northern Santa Fe, and a few others, we've made the repairs on that track, and it is now open again for passenger traffic, albeit at slower speeds. So that's the good news portion of the story. We were able to handle those repairs at a cost that now is going to approach somewhere on the order of $5 million to bring in 12,000 tons of riprap to giant rocks to protect our railroad tracks from that same situation in the near future. But that's only a temporary solution. And we're going to be, I think, as the rail corridor is going to have to consider things that are far longer term in the future. Short-term solutions aren't going to solve our problem. We all are aware of the Del Mar Bluffs, and that was the proverbial camel's nose under the tent. Our concern with what we call the San Clemente landslide risk is just another indication of where things are with our rail corridors that are along the Pacific Ocean, and this is it's no longer a one-off. We at Metrolink are going to continue to play a role working with our member agencies to try to come up with solutions that are more midterm. But as we heard with one of the speakers, I think it was Marlon, who said, all this comes at a cost. And we are going to have to be prepared, just as the state has made really wise choices with the State Highway Operations and Protection Program and being able to set aside funding for emergencies. I think we are going to have to take a serious look that we look at other modes, including rail, to ensure that we have funding to make available to agencies that need to step up in the time of an emergency situation and make these necessary repairs. So we look forward to working with the California Transportation Commission and the California State Transportation Agency and Caltrans to help be a part of that solution as we look towards that future. Thank you, Chair Norton. I appreciate the time.
Thank you. Do you have any comments on that, Mr. Flournoy? And then I had some follow-up things to say.
Sure. Yeah, I agree with everything he said. You know, it's definitely, you know, a long-term approach that we need to be thinking about. But I did want to, you know, give a plug for the California State Rail Plan. You know, it is getting into some of these resilience issues and having that discussion in there and making sure, you know, we're looking at that. So I at least wanted to acknowledge that, you know, from a rail perspective, we are looking at that.
Well, I think what I wanted to make sure is that we have a network plan, that if the rail is out, what's going to happen on the freeways. But, you know, just yesterday, the 101 had wildfire closures. I mean, we need to be able to have these ecosystem alternates. And so we're not in silos in terms of our preparation and resiliency. And especially when we're dealing with challenges of the color of money to address some of these issues. Just want to support what Darren Kettle was saying in terms of an emergency fund that, you know, is adaptable to addressing safe passage through whatever forms it's going to take, because we may have situations where the highway's out and you need to get on rail, or the rail's out and you need to get on the highway, and you just need to be nimble because these are emergency situations and they're happening right now, not long term. So we know this is top of mind for Caltrans, but we just would like to kind of figure out if there's ways in which we can be proactive in thinking about funding opportunities and the ways to highlight the fact that these aren't, you know, one-offs anymore. Wildfires and, you know, erosion and some of these things are with us now, and they may be permanent parts of what's happening about, you know, being a coastal state. So I just wanted some more conversation, and I'm so glad to see that Jeannie Ward Waller of Caltrans has joined us, because I know this is something you think about all the time as well. So.
Well, and I just wanted to give, thank you, Chair. I'll be brief. I just want to give Marlon a little support here, because some of this planning work is being done in our rail and transit division, which is not in Marlon's planning shop, but absolutely there's collaboration. As Marlon described, the vulnerability assessments, that data is available statewide. So it is available to be applied. You know, that science, that look is available to be used on the local system and on the entire transportation network. So the work that we've done to create those data layers and make them available is absolutely data that we should be using in local plans and in our other modal plans. The state rail plan is in development now. I've just had a chance to review the draft, and it definitely speaks to this issue of sea level rise. If you guys have ridden the Capitol Corridor in between Sacramento and Oakland, you recognize that there's a very vulnerable set of tracks there as well. So we're very much aware, you know, keenly concerned about this, and want to work with all of our partners to develop strategies. And the point you're making about rail and highways being, you know, modes that can provide relief, that can provide alternatives when we're dealing with evacuation is an important one. The Smart Railway in Sonoma County was used as a relief when the fires were happening there a few years ago. So this is something we absolutely understand and will see more of. So it's urgent. I think the legislature recognizes it's urgent, which is why there was adaptation money proposed in the budget. So we really appreciate the attention to the issue, and we will keep talking to you about this and you know, bringing the issues to you that Caltrans is really grappling with as we're doing this work. But this is both urgent, and it is also very much, you know, real-time work that we are grappling with. So thank you.
I just wanted to ask a follow-up on that, and that is, you know, what about the funding options? You know, just like you have a sort of wildfire issue, like, look, it's about solving the problem, you know, not worrying about the color of money. Is there an option in this current budget or future budget to have some funding that, you know, could be for these emergency situations, so that what Darren Kettle's talking about having to bring in the rocks, you know, and having the costs rise because of, you know, workforce and other, you know, maybe seal challenges and maybe other things, you know, these unforeseens, what we can do to support having funding set aside for these, you know, contingency issues.
There's absolutely different funding pots that we can draw on today. I think in terms of what you're mentioning about future proposals, you know, there was a $300 million climate adaptation program proposed this year in the budget that was part of that transportation package. That will continue to be part of the discussion going forward. But, you know, there's a difference between the sort of emergency response, emergency repair work and the funding that gets applied to that. And sometimes the federal government comes in and is a partner and helps to reimburse that work. And this like more proactive adaptation work where we're anticipating the damage before it happens and proactively reinforcing the system. So we need funding for both, and certainly it will be a growing need going forward.
No, excellent point. Thank you.
Thank you.
With that, this is an information item, so we want to thank you for a very provocative presentation. We're going to be following this, and we really hope that we can come back and talk to you about where this goes next. And I want to thank everybody for being part of this, and for Darren Kettle of Metrolink for bringing up the situation he's dealing with in real time. Thank you so much. With that, we're going to go to item 22. The evaluation of Caltrans effectiveness in reducing deferred maintenance. Tim Sobelman. Tim?
Thank you, Chair Norton, and good afternoon, Commissioners. Item 22 is an action item related to the evaluation of Caltrans effectiveness in reducing deferred maintenance and improving conditions on the state highway system. As required by Government Code Section 14526.7b and Streets and Highways Code Section 2032.5, Caltrans reported to the Commission at the June 2021 CTC meeting on progress towards meeting the targets and performance measures established for state highways. States and Highways Code Section 2032.5c states that annually, the Commission shall evaluate the effectiveness of Caltrans in reducing deferred maintenance and improving road conditions on the state highway system, as demonstrated by the progress made towards achieving the goals set forth in SB1. As reported by Caltrans, the Commission adopted year-end benchmarks are being exceeded for culverts, transportation management systems, and appears to be exceeding the benchmarks for all classes of pavement and the pavement level of service benchmark. Due to a delay in receiving the pavement condition assessment data, the reported pavement conditions were based on estimated deterioration rates and project level improvements. Once the data is available, Caltrans will compare it to the reported data and submit an updated performance benchmark report to the Commission. Caltrans has reported they have met the fixed 500 additional bridges target and are projected to continue fixing more than the annual baseline number of bridges through 2027. Reported bridge health showed a slight improvement from the prior year. However, Caltrans recognized that future target conditions are not likely to be met without corrective action. To help address this concern, Caltrans has identified a program of projects to focus on bridge deck conditions to accelerate the ability to meet the bridge health targets. This was mentioned earlier by Director Omashakin in his opening remarks.
That's right.
Meeting these benchmarks is evidence that progress towards reducing deferred maintenance and improving road conditions on the state highway system. Commission staff has expressed concerns with Caltrans progress towards meeting the Commission adopted 2027 performance targets for some of the supplementary asset classes. Caltrans has agreed to work with Commission staff to identify achievable targets based on current levels of funding. The Commission expects Caltrans to request the adoption of revised performance targets for supplementary asset classes at an upcoming Commission meeting. Staff recommends that the commission approve the findings of this evaluation and that the evaluation be included in the commission's annual report to the legislature.
Okay. I know that we have a comment from Commissioner Liu, and this is an action item, commissioners. So Commissioner Liu?
Thank you, Chair Norton. Thanks, Tim, for the presentation. And we talked a little bit, got the opportunity to talk a little bit about these supplemental asset classes. I just want to note that, you know, they're considered quote unquote supplemental, but I think a lot of them are really important. And, you know, when I think of highway safety, I mean, highway safety, I certainly think that lighting is one of those things that we should be attuned to in terms of safety. And I also see the roadside rest facilities as sort of a real key touch point where the public judges how well Caltrans is doing and how well all of us involved in state transportation policy and projects are doing. So when we had a conversation about this, you made it clear that the reasons why we need to reconsider what these performance targets are and how they're tracked. Can you just explain what you explained to me about those two particular ones, and why the condition assessment doesn't necessarily reflect the actual condition of those assets?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to do that. Mike Johnson from Caltrans might be on the line if you wanted to take a stab at that. But essentially for both of those assets that you're referring to, the condition assessment that has been developed, the basis of that is an age-based assessment versus a condition-based assessment. So it's a little bit, I wouldn't say it's skewed. However, it doesn't necessarily reflect that they're not important. It's just a way to start that measuring and develop some targets and performance to be able to develop an investment plan around that. And so those percentages may not be as reflective as to what they're evaluating in the actual condition assessment. Those are some of the things we're talking about with Caltrans. I hope that helps explain a little bit. I don't know if Mike's on the line, if you wanted to add anything to that.
Thanks, Tim. And thank you, Commissioner Liu, for the question. Just a little background on why we have sort of these primary asset classes versus supplementary asset classes. It really wasn't to indicate that one's more important than the other. It was a recognition that those that are in the supplementary asset class typically don't have a formal inspection program established similar to pavement or bridge. And so, as Tim mentioned, many of them are just based on age. And as we have been maturing since these targets and asset classes were established in 2017, we recognize the need to move to a condition-based assessment. And we're working with the various programs to do just that. And that includes all of our building facilities, which is a significant component of the shop, as well as things like roadside rests, park and ride lots, and other things. I did also want to mention here that at the time that the supplemental asset classes were established, I think both Caltrans and the Commission recognized the desire to have bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure included as part of a defined asset class. However, that information, the data just wasn't available at the time. And so we used the best available information we had, which was really not the greatest surrogate for it, which was looking at those facilities that had pedestrian accessibility deficiencies identified, or ADA deficiencies. And so as Tim mentioned, we've been working with the Commission and with our programs to relook at all these supplemental asset classes, and we will be coming before the Commission with an action item to not only change targets, but we're actually proposing to remove what is currently in there as park and ride and sidewalk for accessibility only, and actually replace those with the bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure now that that inventory is available. So, we see this as part of the ongoing evolution of our asset management work. We're continuously looking for ways to try to improve. And as, just similar to the prior discussion, as information becomes available, we're bringing it into the asset management fold, getting it into our state highway system management plan, putting it on the table to compete for funding, and these things. But, as was just noted, even with the climate change issues, all of these things are competing for a pot of money that it grew with SB1, but it also, came with a lot of constraints. We have commitments to hit certain performance targets and things. So it just means that we have a pool of funds, but we're trying to do some 36 different things with that, and the money gets divided up quite a bit, and the slices keep getting thinner and thinner. I would completely support that earlier discussion to look for ways, particularly in the climate change arena, but even in some of these others, to bring new revenue into the fold to really get to the kinds of services that we want to provide.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that, and certainly would support that if we could figure out how best to do it. And I think it's important for people to realize that when we talk about changing these performance targets and the metrics that we use to measure them, that we're not just changing them because we can't achieve them, but we're changing them because we're going to try to improve them. And that took a little while for me to appreciate, and it's been helpful for staff and for Caltrans to help explain that.
Very helpful perspective. I don't believe we have any public comment, and this is an action item. So if there are no other commissioner comments, if we could entertain a motion on this item.
So moved, Commissioner Eager.
Thank you.
Second, Commissioner Alvarado.
Okay, Eager, Alvarado. Douglas, could you please read the roll?
Commissioner Alvarado,
Yes, sir.
Commissioner Davis,
Aye.
Commissioner Eager,
Aye.
Commissioner Falcone,
Aye.
Commissioner Grisby,
Aye.
Commissioner Guardino,
Aye.
Commissioner Inman,
Aye.
Commissioner Liu,
Aye.
Commissioner Martinez,
Aye.
Commissioner Tavaloni,
Aye.
Chair Norton.
Aye.
Chair, the motion is approved.
Thank you so much. Now we'll go to item 23. Alicia?
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Tab 23 is an action item for adoption of the fiscal year 2021-22 Road Maintenance and Rehabilitation Account Local Streets and Roads Funding Subsequent Report of Eligible Cities and Counties. For jurisdictions to be included in the fiscal year 21-22 Subsequent Eligibility Report, the jurisdictions must have adopted by resolution a list of projects expected to be funded with the fiscal year program funds for which eligibility is sought. The list and resolution must have been received by the Commission no later than September 30th, 2021. As you may have recalled, at the August 2021 Commission meeting, 519 of the 539 jurisdictions were adopted for initial eligibility. Those submittals were due to us by July 1st, 2021. Commission staff has since confirmed that the 20 remaining jurisdictions identified in Attachment B have met subsequent eligibility on or by September 30th in 2021. The Commission must adopt and submit the subsequent report of these eligible cities and counties to the State Controller's Office on or by October 31st, 2021. Eligible cities and counties who are included in this adoption will begin receiving monthly disbursements from the Controller in November. These disbursements will include the withheld amounts from September and October. Staff recommends the Commission adopt the fiscal year 2021-22 Road Maintenance and Rehabilitation Account, Local Streets and Roads, Funding Subsequent Report of Eligible Cities and Counties as provided in Attachment B, and direct staff to transmit the list of these eligible jurisdictions to the State Controller's Office to begin disbursement of funds. Are there any questions?
Move approval, Commissioner Guardino.
Thank you.
Second,
Do we have a second?
Commissioner Eager.
Wonderful. And before we take the vote, I just wanted to say thank you so much to CTC staff, because this was a significant amount of work to get these other 20 cities to be in compliance and eligible for this funding by the deadline. And it's another case of where CTC staff went above and beyond. So before we take a motion, I just wanted to thank Mitch and the whole team for making sure that instead of letting things happen passively, that you took the opportunity to make sure everyone was in compliance and no one missed out on this funding.
Thank you very much. It's definitely a team effort.
Thank you. With that, Douglas, could you please read the roll?
Commissioner Alvarado,
Yes, sir.
Commissioner Davis,
Aye.
Commissioner Eager,
Aye.
Commissioner Falcone,
Aye.
Commissioner Grisby,
Aye.
Commissioner Guardino,
Aye.
Commissioner Inman,
Aye.
Commissioner Liu,
Aye.
Commissioner Martinez,
Aye.
Commissioner Tavaloni. Commissioner Tavaloni? Chair
I'm
Norton.
sorry.
Oh, thank you. Chair Norton.
Aye.
Chair, the motion is approved.
Thank you so much. And with that, we are going to take a short break until 4 o'clock and resume to finish the balance of the agenda for today.